My name is Eulalia Brooks. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, people would probably describe me with words like reasonable, reliable, or easygoing, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks, the one who doesn't make scenes, the one who understands. I live a fairly ordinary life. I work, I pay my bills, I show up when people need help, and I've always believed that stability matters more than noise. From the outside, there's nothing especially dramatic about me. No loud personality, no need to be the center of attention. And because of that, people often assume something about me that isn't quite true. They assume that because I'm quiet, I don't notice things, but I do. I notice the pauses in conversations when someone decides not to include you. I notice when decisions are made in rooms you were never invited into. And I notice when people grow comfortable with the idea that your opinion simply isn't necessary. For most of my life, my family made important decisions without asking me. Not out of cruelty, exactly. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. It was always framed as practicality, efficiency. We didn't want to bother you, or sometimes it was easier this way. And over time, something strange happened. I became used to hearing about plans after they were already made. A house decision, a financial arrangement, a family commitment. Each time the conversation would sound the same. Oh, we meant to tell you earlier, or you wouldn't have minded anyway. And for years, they were right. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply adjusted. Until one day, a decision that had already been made without me began affecting my own future. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, nothing that would make headlines, but in a quiet, deeply personal way that forced me to confront a question I had avoided for a very long time. Was I truly being considerate, or had I simply allowed myself to become invisible? This story isn't about revenge. There are no shouting matches or a dramatic confrontation waiting at the end. It's about something quieter, about the moment when silence stops being patience and starts becoming a choice, and about what happens when the person everyone assumed would simply adapt decides, very calmly, that she won't anymore. I'm telling this story now because I think many people recognize this pattern, even if they've never named it out loud. Sometimes the loudest shift in a family doesn't begin with anger. Sometimes it begins with someone who has been quiet for a very long time, finally understanding the weight of their own absence. So before I continue, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever realized that people had been making decisions about your life without ever asking what you wanted? If you asked my family to describe me, they would probably say something kind, not glowing, not dramatic, just kind. They'd say I was the reasonable one, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who always understood when things didn't quite go my way. And for a long time, that description felt accurate. I grew up in a family where decisions were rarely dramatic events. They were practical conversations that happened somewhere else, usually between my parents and my older brother. By the time the information reached me, it was already finished. The house was being refinanced. The vacation was planned. The family business was adjusting something. Someone had already signed something. My role in those moments was simple. Listen, nod, adapt. No one ever said it directly, but the pattern was easy to understand. If a decision required debate, I wasn't the person they came to. If something required stability, patience, or help afterward, that's when I appeared. At family dinners, my brother Daniel spoke the most. He had always been that way, confident, persuasive, quick with opinions. My parents admired that about him. They said he had leadership instincts. When Daniel had an idea, everyone leaned in. When I had a thought, the room usually kept moving. Not because they meant to ignore me. It was subtler than that. Someone would interrupt with a practical concern, or the conversation would drift into another topic before my sentence finished forming. Eventually, I stopped trying to insert myself into those spaces. Silence became easier, and honestly, it worked. I had my own life. My job at the architecture firm kept me busy. My apartment in Seattle was quiet, comfortable, and entirely my own. I liked routines. I liked knowing exactly where things were in my home, which drawer held the extra pens, which shelf carried the books I returned to on quiet weekends. In many ways, I was happy. But family patterns have a strange way of following you, even when you don't live under the same roof anymore. Every few weeks, there would be a call, just letting you know we decided to. Daniel thought it would make sense if we already handled the paperwork, but wanted you to hear it from us. I remember one evening standing in my kitchen while my mother explained a financial adjustment related to a property my parents owned. Halfway through the explanation, I realized something. She wasn't asking for my opinion. She was informing me of a completed decision that technically involved me. When she finished, she paused and said lightly, "But you're okay with that, right?" And I said the thing I almost always said. Of course. It wasn't a lie, at least not exactly. At that point in my life, my instinct wasn't to challenge people. My instinct was to maintain peace. I believed that if something truly important came along, something that genuinely required my voice, someone would ask for it. Looking back now, I understand how naive that belief was. Because the truth is, roles inside families tend to solidify quietly. Daniel became the decision maker, my parents became the coordinators, and I became the person who adjusted. Reliable, cooperative, lowest maintenance. Invisible in the most polite possible way. The strange part is that invisibility doesn't hurt at first. In the beginning, it almost feels like freedom. No pressure to argue, no responsibility for outcomes, just the quiet relief of letting someone else carry the weight of choice. But over time, something else begins to happen. When people grow accustomed to not hearing your voice, they stop remembering it exists. And the first time I truly noticed that shift wasn't during a major argument or dramatic event. It happened during something so small that most people in the room probably forgot it before the evening ended. But I didn't. Because that moment was the first small cut, the kind that doesn't look like much, until years later, when you realize it never actually healed. The first moment that stayed with me happened during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Nothing unusual about the evening. My mother had cooked far too much food, as she always did when everyone came over. The table was crowded with bowls, serving dishes, and the familiar sound of chairs scraping softly against the kitchen floor. Daniel arrived late, talking as he walked through the door. He had that energy people tend to follow. Fast-moving ideas, confident conclusions, a tone that suggested the conversation had already been decided somewhere else. That night, the topic was a small piece of property my parents owned outside the city. Not a large investment, just a modest house they had rented out for years. Daniel had a plan. He spoke for several minutes without interruption, explaining how selling the property now would be smarter than waiting. He had apparently already spoken to a friend in real estate. The market was favorable, timing was good, it made sense. My parents listened carefully. They asked questions about timing, taxes, and paperwork. Daniel answered each one smoothly. He sounded prepared, organized. At some point during the conversation, my mother looked at me. "Eulalia, what do you think?" It surprised me a little, because that didn't happen often. For a second, I actually paused, making sure she had meant to ask. I had been thinking about something specific while Daniel spoke, a detail about tenant agreements and notice periods. At work, I dealt with administrative documents constantly, and something about the timeline he mentioned sounded optimistic, so I answered carefully. "I'm not sure the lease allows a sale that quickly without notice," I said. "You might want to check the contract before listing it." It wasn't criticism, just a practical thought. Daniel nodded vaguely while I spoke, but before I could finish the sentence, he was already responding. "Oh, that's not really an issue," he said with an easy wave of his hand. "Those contracts are flexible. My friend handles these all the time." The conversation moved forward immediately. My father asked another question. My mother reached for another serving dish. Daniel continued outlining the plan as if nothing had interrupted the flow. No one disagreed with me, but no one returned to the point either. And the strange part is, I didn't push it. I could have. It would have been easy to say, "I'm serious, you should check the lease." But something in the room had already shifted back to its normal rhythm. Daniel speaking. My parents are listening, the plan is forming around them. So I let the moment pass. Dinner continued. By the time dessert arrived, the decision had essentially been made. Daniel would contact the realtor. My parents would begin preparing paperwork. At the end of the night, while we were clearing dishes, my mother smiled at me and said something she probably meant as reassurance. "It's good that Daniel keeps track of these things. He's very proactive." I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "He is." And technically, the evening ended without conflict. But on the drive home, I kept thinking about something small. Not the decision itself. Selling the property might have been perfectly reasonable. What stayed with me was the speed with which my voice had disappeared from the conversation. It had been invited. And then, almost immediately, it had been dismissed. Not with disagreement, but with something quieter, assumption. The assumption is that Daniel probably understood the situation better. The assumption that my comment was simply a detail that didn't matter much. Most people in that room likely forgot the moment within hours. But I remembered it, because something about it felt like the first time I clearly saw the role I had been quietly occupying for years. Not excluded, just easily set aside. And once you notice something like that, you start seeing it more often than you expected. After that dinner, life continued exactly as it always had. No arguments. No confrontations, no dramatic fallout from the property decision, In fact, for a while, it seemed like nothing had happened at all. And that was part of the pattern. Moments like that didn't explode into conflict. They simply dissolved into the background of everyday life. A few weeks later, my mother called while I was leaving work. "Oh, we listed the house," she said casually. Daniel handled everything with the realtor. It moved very quickly. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk outside my office building. "That was fast," I said. "Yes, but it worked out nicely," she replied. "The tenants are moving out next month." There was a small silence between us. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet space in the conversation where something could have been acknowledged. Instead, she moved on to another topic. Dinner plans for the weekend, my father's new hobby of fixing old furniture, a neighbor who had just retired, and I let the conversation follow that direction. After we hung up, I stood there for a moment, watching people pass by on the street. I realized something simple. They hadn't checked the lease, at least not before deciding everything else. But strangely enough, that realization didn't make me angry. It made me thoughtful. Because the truth was, this kind of thing had happened before. Not always with property decisions or paperwork, but with smaller parts of life. Family vacations were planned without asking if my schedule worked. Holiday gatherings were arranged in ways that assumed I would simply adjust. Financial discussions that reached conclusions before my name entered the conversation. Each situation had its own explanation. "We didn't want to bother you. You're always flexible. You're the easiest person to coordinate with." And every time I heard those phrases, I responded the same way. "It's fine." For years, I genuinely believed that. I told myself that families needed people who kept things smooth, that not every opinion needs to be voiced, that peace inside a group sometimes required someone to step back. The problem was that stepping back gradually turned into standing outside the circle entirely. And the more it happened, the easier it became for everyone involved, including me. Because there's a certain comfort in being the agreeable person. People praise you for it. "You're so understanding. You never make things difficult. We can always count on you." At first, those compliments feel warm. Later, you start noticing what they actually mean. They mean people have learned you won't challenge the plan. They mean your flexibility has become predictable. They mean decisions can move forward without the extra step of asking what you think. Looking back now, I understand something important about those years. No one in my family woke up one morning and decided my voice didn't matter. The shift happened gradually. A missed moment here, a dismissed comment there, a pattern of convenience slowly turning into expectation, and I participated in that pattern too. Every time I said "it's fine," I helped reinforce the role they had quietly assigned to me: reliable, supportive, and increasingly, optional. But even then, I still believed something about the structure of our family. I believed that if a decision ever truly affected my life in a serious way, someone would pause long enough to include me. That assumption stayed with me for years, until one evening, when I finally understood the role everyone had unconsciously written for me. Not the role I thought I had, the one they had been quietly expecting me to play all along. It took me longer than it should have to recognize the role my family had quietly assigned to me. Not because the signs weren't there, they were. In small conversations, in passing comments, in the way certain decisions always seemed to move forward without my involvement. But when something happens slowly enough, you learn to interpret it as normal. The moment everything became clear wasn't dramatic. It happened during a family gathering that looked, on the surface, completely ordinary. My parents had invited everyone over on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel arrived with his usual confident energy, already discussing something with my father as they walked into the living room. I was in the kitchen with my mother, helping her set out coffee cups. She leaned against the counter and said casually, "Daniel has an idea about the lake house." My parents owned a small cabin near a lake about 2 hours outside the city. It had been in the family for years, a quiet place we visited during the summers when I was younger. "What kind of idea, mine?" I asked. "Oh, just something practical," she said. "You'll hear about it in a minute." That phrase again. You'll hear about it. Not we want to discuss it. Not that we're thinking about something. Just the quiet assumption that the conversation had already started somewhere else. A few minutes later, we all gathered in the living room. Daniel explained his proposal. He thought the lake house should be renovated and turned into a short-term rental property. The area had become popular with tourists, and he believed it could generate significant income. He spoke confidently, outlining potential costs and profits as if he had been preparing the idea for some time. My father nodded thoughtfully. My mother listened with interest. At one point, Daniel turned toward me. "Of course," he added. "Eulalia probably won't mind. She doesn't go there much anyway." The room stayed quiet for a second. It wasn't an insult. His tone wasn't hostile or dismissive. It was simply certain. certain that my opinion would align with the plan, certain that my relationship with the place didn't require discussion. And what struck me in that moment wasn't just what Daniel said. It was because no one corrected him. No one asked if I had a different perspective. No one paused the conversation to include me properly. The assumption had already settled into the room like a piece of furniture everyone was used to seeing. Eulalia won't mind. And once again, the familiar choice appeared in front of me. I could challenge the assumption, or I could maintain the peace. For a moment, I studied the faces around me. Daniel was confident in his idea. My parents are interested in the possibilities, the comfortable momentum of a decision already moving forward. So I said the thing that had become almost automatic over the years. If that's what everyone thinks makes sense, I replied calmly, then it's probably fine. The conversation continued immediately. Renovation budgets, booking platforms, possible timelines. My role in the discussion ended the moment I agreed not to resist. Later that evening, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I found myself thinking about that sentence Daniel had used. She probably won't mind. It wasn't cruel, but it revealed something important. My family didn't see me as someone whose voice shaped decisions. They saw me as someone whose cooperation allowed decisions to proceed smoothly, reliable, helpful, predictable. And in that moment, standing alone at the kitchen sink, I finally understood something I had been slowly ignoring for years. I hadn't just been overlooked. I had been assigned a role. The quiet supporter, the person who made other people's plans easier, and for a long time, I had played that role perfectly. But something about that realization stayed with me long after the evening ended. Because once you recognize the part you've been given in a story, you begin to wonder whether you still want to keep playing it. The shift didn't happen during a conversation. No confrontation. No sudden argument where years of frustration finally exploded. If you had looked at my life from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual that day at all. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. I had just returned home from work. My apartment was exactly the way I had left it that morning. Calm, orderly, silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I remember setting my bag down on the small table near the door and checking my phone. There was a message from my mother. "Call me when you have a minute." Nothing urgent in the wording, just the same gentle tone she always used. So I called. She answered quickly, sounding cheerful. "We were talking earlier," she said, "and Daniel brought up something we think makes a lot of sense." I sat down at the kitchen counter, already familiar with the rhythm of these conversations. "What is it?" I asked. "Well," she continued, "since Daniel is the one managing the lake house renovation, we thought it might be simpler if the ownership paperwork were adjusted." I felt a small pause inside my chest. "Adjusted how?" "Oh, nothing dramatic," she said quickly. "Just transferring the property into Daniel's name, so the business side is easier to manage." For a moment, the room felt very still. The lake house, the same place that had been part of our family for decades, the same place where my parents had always said the property would eventually belong to both Daniel and me. Except now, apparently, that understanding had changed. "And when was this decided?" I asked quietly. "Oh, we talked about it this weekend," my mother said. "It's just more efficient this way." Efficient, that word again. I didn't interrupt her explanation. She continued describing legal convenience, taxes, and Daniel's role in handling the renovations. None of the reasons sounded malicious. In fact, from a purely practical perspective, they probably made sense. But something about the conversation felt different from the dozens of similar ones I had heard over the years. Because this time, the decision wasn't just something happening in my life. It was something quietly removing a piece of my future. And the most striking part was the assumption beneath it, that I would hear the explanation, pause briefly, and then respond the way I always had. "It's fine." My mother finished speaking and waited. I looked down at the kitchen counter in front of me. The wood surface had a small scratch near the edge that I had noticed countless times before. For some reason, my attention settled on that tiny imperfection while my mind moved through the conversation again. Not the property, not the paperwork, the pattern, a plan discussed elsewhere, a decision has been made, a phone call afterward. And suddenly I understood something with unusual clarity. My silence over the years hadn't just been patience. It had become permission. Permission for people to assume my absence from the decision-making process was acceptable, even logical. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, calmer than I had expected to feel. "Okay," I said finally. My mother sounded relieved. "I knew you'd understand," she replied warmly. We talked for another minute about unrelated things before ending the call. Afterward, I sat alone in my quiet apartment for a long time. Not upset, not emotional, just thinking. Because something inside me had shifted very slightly during that conversation. For the first time, I understood that if I continued behaving the way I always had, nothing about this pattern would ever change. And the strange thing was that I didn't feel the urge to argue with anyone about it. I didn't want a dramatic confrontation. I didn't want explanations or apologies. Instead, a quieter thought began forming in my mind. If everyone already believed I would stay silent, then perhaps silence could become something else entirely. Not resignation, a choice. After that phone call, something subtle changed in the way I listened to my family. From the outside, nothing about my behavior looked different. I still answered calls. I still attended family dinners. I still responded calmly when someone explained a new plan that had already been decided. But internally, the way I heard those conversations had shifted. Before, I had listened as someone trying to stay cooperative. Now, I listened as someone paying attention. A few weeks after the lake house conversation, Daniel called me one evening. His tone was upbeat, almost celebratory. Renovations are moving fast, he said. We're already getting interest from rental platforms. That's good, I replied. He continued explaining the business potential. Seasonal bookings, weekend tourists, maybe even corporate retreats if the property was marketed correctly. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not challenging anything he said. At one point, he mentioned a detail about financing part of the renovation through a short-term loan tied to the property. The comment caught my attention. In my work, administrative systems and documentation were part of daily life. You learn quickly how certain arrangements function, who signs what, which names appear on which documents, and how responsibility is assigned. But instead of questioning him, I simply asked something neutral. Did the bank require a lot of paperwork? Not really, he said confidently. It was pretty straightforward. And he moved on to another topic before I could ask anything else. And I let him. A year earlier, that might have been the end of my curiosity, but now silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt useful. The less I interrupted, the more people spoke freely. Daniel began sharing more details about the renovation project during our occasional calls. My parents mentioned timelines, contractors, and legal adjustments during family dinners. None of them seemed to notice that I had started listening more closely than before. Perhaps they assumed my quietness meant the same thing it always had. Agreement. But something else was happening. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to shape conversations. I simply let them unfold. And when people believe their plans are unquestioned, they tend to explain more than they realize. One evening, my father mentioned something casually while we were cleaning up after dinner. Daniel's name is on most of the renovation documents now, he said. It keeps things simpler. I nodded. That makes sense. He seemed satisfied with the response and continued drying dishes, but that single sentence stayed with me. Most of the renovation documents, not all. I didn't ask for clarification. Instead, I made a quiet mental note of the wording. Later that night, driving home through the quiet streets of Seattle, I thought about the pattern forming in front of me. For years, my silence had allowed decisions to happen around me. Now that same silence was revealing the structure of those decisions more clearly than before. And the more I listened, the more I realized something important. My family wasn't hiding information from me intentionally. They simply believed I had no reason to question anything, which meant they spoke openly, freely, comfortably. In their minds, nothing had changed. But for me, silence had taken on a new purpose. It was no longer the absence of a voice. It was space, space to observe, space to understand, space to notice details that people assumed I wasn't paying attention to. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, I began gathering pieces of information, the same way I had always organized things in my professional life, carefully, patiently, without drawing attention, because the more I listened, the clearer something became. There were aspects of this situation my family had never noticed, small details, practical realities. Things are hiding quietly beneath the surface of their plans, things that, once fully understood, would change everything. Once I stopped trying to correct people in real time, something interesting began to happen. I started seeing the full shape of things. For years, I had been responding to moments, small conversations, quick decisions. But now that I was paying attention without interrupting, the pattern connecting those moments became clearer. And like most patterns, it wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on an assumption. My family assumed Daniel was the one who handled complex decisions. They assumed my parents managed the practical logistics, and they assumed I would always adapt. Those assumptions had quietly structured years of choices. But assumptions, like any structure, only work when everyone involved continues behaving the way the structure expects. My behavior hadn't changed visibly, but my attention had. One evening after work, I opened the dark blue leather notebook I kept on my desk. I had owned that notebook for years. At first, it held ordinary things, grocery lists, work reminders, occasional personal thoughts. But over time, it had become something more useful, a place to organize information, dates, details from conversations, small observations that might matter later. That evening, I began writing down what I knew about the lake house situation. Nothing dramatic, just facts. The date my mother first mentioned the ownership transfer, the approximate timeline Daniel described for renovations, the financing arrangement he briefly referenced during one of our calls. At first, the list looked simple, but when you place small details side by side, they begin to reveal relationships you might not notice otherwise. For example, Daniel had described the renovation loan as straightforward. But loans secured against property usually require very specific documentation, particularly when ownership structures have recently changed. I didn't know the exact arrangement they had used, but I knew enough about administrative systems to understand something important. Paperwork always leaves a trail, not because anyone intends it to, but because processes require it. The next few weeks became quietly interesting. Whenever the topic of the lake house appeared in conversation, I listened carefully. Daniel spoke enthusiastically about projected rental income. My parents mentioned how busy the contractors were. Occasionally, someone referenced paperwork or permits in passing. I never interrupted. I simply asked the occasional neutral question. Oh, that sounds complicated. Did the county require a lot of permits? Was the financing process difficult? Questions that sounded casual, questions that didn't challenge anything. People tend to answer those questions openly because they don't feel like scrutiny. And over time, the picture grew clearer, not dramatically clearer, just enough. One afternoon at work, while organizing vendor contracts for the architecture firm, I noticed something that made me pause. The document I was reviewing had a familiar structure, one that often appeared in property-related agreements. Primary owner, secondary, responsible party, financial guarantor. Those roles weren't unusual. They existed in countless legal arrangements, but suddenly I remembered the phrasing my father had used that night while drying dishes. Daniel's name is on most of the renovation documents. Most, not all. I closed the folder on my desk and leaned back in my chair for a moment, because a quiet possibility had just crossed my mind. If Daniel had taken primary control of the renovation process, and if certain documents required additional names or guarantees, then someone else might still exist somewhere inside the structure of that arrangement. Someone whose role hadn't been discussed openly. Someone whose involvement might have been assumed rather than properly explained. The thought didn't make me excited. It made me curious. And curiosity, when paired with patience, can be a very effective tool. So that evening, when I returned to my apartment, I opened my notebook again. I wrote down a single sentence. What exactly is my name attached to? Not as an accusation, just as a question worth answering. Because the more I observed the situation, the more I realized something important. My family believed the lake house project was entirely under Daniel's control. They believed the ownership transfer had simplified everything. They believed the decisions had already been made. But decisions often rely on structures people don't fully examine once they feel confident about the outcome. And if there was one thing my work had taught me over the years, it was this. Structures always reveal their true shape. Eventually, all it takes is someone patient enough to look closely. And as I continued gathering small pieces of information over the following weeks, one realization slowly came into focus. There was something about the situation my family had never fully noticed. Something that had been sitting quietly in the background of their plans from the very beginning, waiting to be understood. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, the way most important truths do, through small confirmations that quietly settle into place until the picture becomes impossible to ignore. One afternoon, a few weeks after I had started paying closer attention, my mother called again. Her tone was slightly more practical than usual. Daniel mentioned something about a document, she said. It might arrive in your mail soon. I leaned back in my chair at the small desk in my apartment. A document? Yes, she replied, just something related to the renovation financing. Nothing complicated. The way she said nothing complicated made me smile slightly. Most paperwork described that way tends to be exactly the opposite. What do I need to do with it? I asked. Oh, probably just sign where indicated, she said. Daniel said it's a formality. A formality, another phrase I had heard many times in administrative environments. And once again, I chose the same approach I had been using for weeks. Okay, I said calmly. A few days later, the envelope arrived. It wasn't large or dramatic, just a standard mailing from a financial institution. The kind of envelope that looks routine enough to be opened casually between other tasks. But when you spend years working with documentation, you learn something simple. Routine envelopes often contain very important details. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were several pages of financial paperwork related to the renovation loan Daniel had mentioned weeks earlier. At first glance, the structure looked exactly like many other property financing agreements I had seen before. Property description, loan amount, terms, repayment conditions, nothing unusual. But as my eyes moved through the pages, I reached the section that listed responsible parties. And there it was, Daniel Brooks, primary borrower, followed by another line. Eulalia Brooks, secondary financial guarantor. I read the line twice, not because it was confusing, because it confirmed something I had quietly suspected for several weeks. Despite the ownership transfer, despite the assumption that Daniel was fully managing the project, my name still existed inside the financial structure of the renovation, not as an owner, not as a decision maker, but as a guarantor, which meant something very specific. If the project succeeded, Daniel would benefit from the income and control of the property. But if something went wrong financially, responsibility could extend to me. The room around me remained completely silent while that understanding settled into place. What struck me most wasn't the legal detail itself. It was the fact that no one had ever explained it clearly. Not my parents, not Daniel. They had simply assumed the document was a technical step I would complete without much attention. Perhaps they believed I wouldn't read it carefully, or perhaps they assumed it didn't matter. Either way, I felt something unusual in that moment. Not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. For years, decisions had been made without asking my opinion, but now one of those decisions had quietly attached financial responsibility to my name, without discussion, without consent beyond a casual request to sign where indicated. I closed the folder and placed it neatly on the table. Then I opened my notebook. Under the previous entries about the lake house, I added a new line. Secondary guarantor listed on renovation loan. I sat there for a while, thinking through the implications. Legally, the situation was straightforward. Signing the document would finalize my role in the financing structure. Refusing to sign would likely force the bank to reconsider the loan arrangement. Either way, the choice mattered. And for the first time in years, a decision involving my family required my active participation. But what surprised me most was how calm I felt about it, because this wasn't a moment for emotional reactions. It was simply information, useful, clarifying information about the true structure of the situation. For years, my silence had allowed decisions to move forward around me. Now that same silence had revealed something none of them seemed to realize. The entire renovation plan still depended on my participation. They just hadn't noticed. And as I looked down at the paperwork on the table, a quiet understanding settled into place. For the first time since this story began, the next decision wasn't already made. It was mine. The envelope stayed on my kitchen table for 2 days. Not because I was confused about the decision in front of me, but I wanted to think about it carefully before doing anything at all. Over the years, I had learned something useful about moments like this. When people feel pressured to respond quickly, they often react emotionally. They argue, explain themselves, or make choices simply to resolve the discomfort of the situation. But I didn't feel rushed. The document was waiting for my signature, but no one had demanded an immediate response. Daniel assumed I would sign it. My mother assumed it was already handled. The entire situation was resting on a quiet expectation that my role in the story would continue exactly as it always had. And for the first time, I realized how many options actually existed. Option 1 was the easiest. I could sign the document. That would confirm my position as the secondary financial guarantor. The renovation would continue without interruption. Daniel's business plan would move forward exactly as he expected, and life inside the family would remain peaceful. But the structure of that option was very clear. Daniel would hold the property. Daniel would manage the rental income, and I would quietly carry financial responsibility if something went wrong. It was a familiar pattern. Support without authority, risk without participation. Option 2 was more confrontational. I could call Daniel and explain that I wasn't comfortable signing the document. We could have a long conversation about fairness, expectations, and communication. Perhaps my parents would join the discussion. There might be explanations, apologies, maybe even revisions to the arrangement. But that path felt strangely unnecessary, because arguing about the past didn't actually solve the structural issue in front of me. The real question wasn't whether anyone meant to exclude me. The question was whether I would continue participating in a system where my involvement only appeared when responsibility was required. On the third evening, I sat down at the table again and reviewed the document one more time. Every line was clear. Every role is carefully defined. Primary borrower, secondary guarantor. A quiet arrangement built on the assumption that I wouldn't examine it too closely. I closed the folder and rested my hands on the table for a moment. And then a third option came into focus. Not confrontation, not a silent agreement. Something simpler. The document didn't require an explanation. It required a signature, or the absence of one. And suddenly I understood something important about the situation. The renovation project depended on financing. The financing depended on the guarantor structure, and the guarantor structure depended on my participation, which meant the entire plan my family had confidently built over the past several months rested on a very quiet assumption that I would sign without hesitation. For years, I had responded to decisions after they were already made. Now, for the first time, the next step could not happen unless I allowed it. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt balanced. Because this wasn't about punishing anyone or forcing a confrontation. It was simply about choosing whether my name would continue appearing inside arrangements I hadn't been invited to shape. I placed the document back into its envelope. Then I set it aside on the corner of my desk. No phone calls, no announcements, just a quiet decision about what I would do next. And for the first time since this entire situation began, the silence between my family and me carried a very different meaning. They believed the process was already moving forward. They believed the paperwork was just a formality. But sometimes, the smallest step in a plan turns out to be the one that matters most. And this time, that step belonged to me. After I set the envelope aside, I didn't think about it again for several days. Not because the decision was unimportant. In fact, it was the opposite. When something matters, I've learned that distance can be useful. It allows you to see the situation without the pressure of other people's expectations. During that week, life continued exactly as it always had. I went to work. I organized documents at the office. I answered emails and coordinated project timelines the way I did every day. From the outside, nothing about my routine had changed. But internally, I had started thinking about something slightly different. Not the renovation project, the structure behind it. One evening after work, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook again. Under the notes I had already written about the lake house, I added a new section. Not emotional reflections, just practical considerations. What responsibilities would exist if I signed the document? What risks might exist if the rental project struggled financially? What alternatives might the bank require if a guarantor declined? The more I wrote, the clearer something became. The arrangement my family had created depended heavily on momentum. They had already moved forward with renovations, contractors, and marketing ideas. At this stage, the financing structure probably felt like a small, technical detail. But in reality, that detail held everything together. Without a guarantor structure, banks often reconsider loan approvals, especially when a property has recently changed ownership. I didn't know the exact terms Daniel had negotiated, but the general principle was easy to understand. Remove one support beam, and the structure has to be rebuilt. That evening, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't sign the document, but I also wouldn't create a dramatic moment around it. No accusations, no confrontation, just patience. Because processes have timelines. Eventually, someone would notice the missing signature. Eventually, a bank representative or loan officer would ask a question. And eventually, Daniel would realize that the step he believed was automatic hadn't happened. A week later, my mother called again. Her voice sounded relaxed, the same warm tone she always used. "Did that paperwork arrive?" "Work?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Good," she replied. "Daniel said the bank just needs it returned soon." "Soon." I thought about the word for a moment. "I'll look at it again tonight," I told her calmly. "That's perfect," she said. "It should be quick." We talked for another minute before ending the call. I placed the phone down on the table and returned to the book I had been reading. No urgency, no pressure, just time passing quietly. A few days later, Daniel sent a short message. "Did you get the loan document? Bank's asking if everything's signed." I read the message twice before replying. "Yes, I received it." He responded quickly. "Great, just sign and send back when you get a chance." I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I placed the phone face down on the table and went back to making dinner. Because there was something strangely peaceful about the situation. For the first time in years, my role in a family decision wasn't defined by reacting to a finished plan. Instead, the plan itself had quietly paused. Not because of an argument, not because anyone had forced it to stop, but because a single assumption, one that had existed for years, was no longer automatically true. My silence had once allowed decisions to move forward. Now that same silence was doing something very different. It was creating space, a space where people would eventually have to notice something they had overlooked from the beginning. The fact that I had never actually agreed to carry the responsibility they had assigned to me. And when that realization finally arrived, the consequences would begin unfolding on their own. The first sign that something had shifted arrived quietly. Not through an argument, not through an urgent phone call, just a short message from Daniel late one afternoon. "Hey, the bank says they still haven't received your signed copy." I was sitting at my desk at work when the message appeared. The office was calm, most people focused on their own projects, the low hum of printers and keyboards filling the space. I read the message once, then placed the phone back on the desk without responding immediately. Not to delay anything intentionally, just to let the moment exist for a second, because this was the point where the plan my family had built began encountering reality. For months, everything about the renovation project had moved forward smoothly. Contractors had been hired, materials had been ordered, marketing ideas were already forming in Daniel's mind. Momentum had carried the entire process forward until now. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "Did you send it already or not yet?" I picked up the phone and typed a simple response. "I received the document, yes." There was a short pause before his reply came back. "Okay, Sol, but the bank says they need it signed." I looked at the message for a moment, then I answered honestly. "I haven't signed it." Several minutes passed before he replied again. When the message finally arrived, the tone had changed slightly. Not angry, just confused. Why not? It was a reasonable question, but interestingly, it was also the first time anyone had asked me directly about my decision in this situation. For months, the assumption had been that my participation was automatic. Now suddenly my choice mattered. I typed slowly. "I wanted to review the terms carefully." Another pause, then, "It's just standard loan paperwork." I had expected that response. People often describe complicated agreements as simple when they believe the outcome should be obvious. So I replied with the same calm tone I had used in every conversation throughout this entire story. "It lists me as a financial guarantor." This time the pause was longer. Eventually Daniel responded, "Yeah, that's just how the bank structured it." Just. Another familiar word. For years, small decisions had been framed as simple, practical, and efficient. But now that same structure was encountering something new. A person who had actually read the document. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse him of anything. Instead, I wrote something very straightforward. If I sign it, I become responsible for the loan if the project can't repay it. Several minutes passed. When his next message appeared, the confidence in his tone had softened. It's not like that's going to happen. And he might have believed that completely, but belief and legal responsibility are not the same thing. So I answered the only way that felt honest. "Maybe not, but the document still makes me responsible." The conversation stopped there. No anger, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. But something had clearly changed, because for the first time since the renovation project began, the structure behind it had been acknowledged out loud. My name wasn't just a technical detail, it carried real consequences. That evening, I received a call from my mother. Her voice sounded slightly uncertain when I answered. "Daniel mentioned you had questions about the paperwork." I sat down at the kitchen table, where the envelope still rested. "Yes," I said calmly. "What kind of questions?" she asked. I looked down at the document again. Not frustrated, not upset, just clear. "The kind you ask before you agree to something," I replied. And for the first time in years, the silence on the other end of the phone felt different. Not dismissive, not impatient, just uncertain. Because the role my family had grown comfortable assigning to me was no longer functioning the way they expected. And once a pattern like that breaks, people begin noticing the consequences very quickly. The days after that conversation were unusually quiet. Not the comfortable quiet I had grown used to over the years, where everyone simply moved forward with their plans and assumed I would follow along. This was a different kind of silence, one that felt unsettled. Daniel didn't message again that evening. My mother didn't call back to continue the discussion. For a while, it seemed like everyone involved was thinking through the situation privately, trying to understand how something that had once felt straightforward had suddenly become complicated. 3 days later, my phone rang during lunch. It was my father. He rarely called in the middle of the day, so I stepped outside the office building before answering. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart," he said gently. "Daniel told me there's a small delay with the loan paperwork." A small delay. I almost smiled at the phrasing. "Yes," I replied. "I wanted to understand the document before signing it." There was a brief pause on the line. Well, it's really just a formality, he said carefully. That word again, formality. For years, that word had allowed many decisions to move forward without deeper discussion. But now the meaning had shifted. Not exactly, I said calmly. Another pause. What do you mean? The document lists me as a guarantor for the loan, I explained. That means if the renovation business can't repay it, the bank can require payment from me. My father was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice sounded slightly more serious. Well, yes, technically that's how those things work. Technically. Another word that softens reality. I leaned against the cool brick wall outside my office building and looked out at the street. Did anyone intend to explain that to me? I asked. The question wasn't confrontational, just direct. My father hesitated. We assumed Daniel mentioned it, he said finally. I thought back to all the conversations over the past few months. Renovation plans, rental income projections, contractor timelines, but never a clear explanation of financial responsibility. He didn't, I said. My father sighed quietly. Well, the renovation is already underway, he said. A lot of money has been committed. And that sentence revealed something important, the structure of the situation. Decisions had been made, contracts signed, work started, all under the assumption that the final piece of paperwork would simply fall into place. My signature. But the truth was that step had never actually happened, which meant the entire plan had been built on something fragile. Expectation, no agreement. Daniel thought it would be fine, my father continued. He believed the project was safe. I'm sure he does, Ibra says, I replied. And I meant that sincerely. Daniel had always been confident in his ideas, but confidence and responsibility are two very different things. My father spoke again, more carefully this time. Is there something that would make you comfortable signing it? I considered the question for a moment. Years earlier, I might have responded immediately, tried to negotiate a compromise, suggested changes that would allow the project to continue while making the arrangement feel fair. But now something felt different, because the problem wasn't the document itself. It was the sequence of decisions that had led to it. Ownership transferred, renovations started, loans negotiated, all before anyone thought to ask whether I was willing to carry financial risk for the project. And once a structure reaches that point, adjustments become difficult. Not impossible, but complicated. I don't think so, I said quietly. Another long silence settled over the phone. Finally, my father spoke again. We might have to restructure the loan, he said. Yes, I replied. Or delay it, or reduce it, or possibly cancel it entirely. All possibilities that existed simply because one assumption had turned out to be incorrect. For the first time since the renovation project began, the reality of the situation had caught up with the plan, and by the time everyone realized that, most of the decisions had already been made. The first face-to-face conversation happened the following weekend. My parents had invited both Daniel and me over for dinner. The invitation sounded ordinary when my mother mentioned it on the phone, but the careful tone in her voice made it clear that the evening had a purpose. When I arrived, Daniel was already there. He was standing near the living room window, talking quietly with our father. The moment he noticed me, the conversation paused briefly. Not dramatically, just long enough for everyone in the room to acknowledge that the subject they had been discussing was now present. Dinner itself was calm. My mother served food, my father asked a few routine questions about work, and Daniel spoke about traffic on the drive over. Anyone walking past the house might have assumed it was just another family meal, but underneath the polite conversation, everyone was waiting for the same moment. Eventually, my father cleared his throat gently. Maybe we should talk about the paperwork situation, he said. The room became still. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, resting his elbows on the table. His expression wasn't angry, but there was a seriousness in his posture that hadn't been there before. I didn't realize you had concerns about the loan, he said, looking at me. I didn't realize my name would be part of the loan, I replied calmly. The exchange wasn't hostile, just direct. Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging the point. Well, the bank suggested adding another guarantor, he said. It helps secure better terms. That makes sense, I said. He seemed slightly surprised by the agreement. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother asked the question that had probably been forming in everyone's mind. So, you're not comfortable signing it? I folded my hands lightly on the table. I'm not comfortable guaranteeing a loan for a property I don't own or control. Again, the words weren't emotional. They were simply factual. Daniel exhaled slowly. It's not like I'm expecting the project to fail, he said. I know, I replied, but the document still assigns that responsibility. My father looked between us. The renovations are already underway, he said quietly. I understand, I said. And I did. Contractors had been hired, materials ordered, plans set in motion months earlier. The project existed now in a very real way, but the financing structure supporting it had assumed something that never actually happened. My agreement. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. So what happens now? He asked. The question hung in the air for a moment, and the interesting thing was that no one in the room was angry. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic family conflict. Just 4 people sitting around a table acknowledging the consequences of a decision that had been made without one person's participation. The bank will probably need to restructure the loan, I said. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. That could slow everything down. Yes, I said. My mother sighed softly. We should have explained the paperwork more clearly, she admitted. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Yes, I said again, but the tone of the word wasn't harsh, just honest, because by this point, assigning blame didn't really solve anything. The situation had already moved past that stage. The renovation project would now have to adapt to a new reality, not because anyone had been punished, not because anyone had fought, but simply because one person had quietly declined a responsibility that had been assigned without her consent. And for the first time in years, the structure of our family conversation had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that everyone in the room had to acknowledge something they hadn't considered before. My voice wasn't absent anymore. In the weeks after that dinner, the situation gradually settled into a new shape. Not a dramatic one. There were no family arguments that tore relationships apart. No long periods of silence where people refused to speak to one another. In many ways, life continued exactly as it had before. But something subtle had changed. The renovation project did slow down. The bank required Daniel to restructure the financing without my name attached to it. That meant new paperwork, new timelines, and a few adjustments to the scale of the renovation. At one point, Daniel mentioned that he had to invest more of his own funds to keep the project moving. He said it matter-of-factly, not accusingly, and I listened the same way I always had, calmly. The interesting part was that no one in my family treated the situation as a betrayal. There were no accusations that I had ruined anything, no emotional speeches about loyalty or obligation. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that something about the way decisions had been handled before had shifted. The next time a family conversation involved property or finances, something small happened that I noticed immediately. My father paused before continuing his explanation and said, almost casually, "We should probably hear what Eulalia thinks about this." The sentence lasted only a few seconds, but it carried years of change inside it, because for most of my adult life, those kinds of conversations had reached conclusions before my voice entered the room. Now the structure was different. Not because I had demanded attention, not because I had fought for recognition, but because once I had simply declined to carry a responsibility that had been quietly placed on me. Over time, that small decision seemed to reshape how my family saw me. Daniel still spoke confidently about his ideas. My parents still discussed plans with the same practical tone they had always used. But now, when those plans touched something that involved me, there was a pause, a moment where someone asked a question instead of making an assumption. And the strange part is that I didn't feel triumphant about it. I didn't feel like I had won anything. Because this story was never really about the lake house. It was about something much simpler, the difference between being helpful and being invisible. For many years, I believed the two were the same. I thought that being supportive meant stepping aside whenever other people were confident about their decisions. But now I understand something I didn't fully see before. You can be calm without disappearing. You can be cooperative without surrendering responsibility for your own future. And sometimes the most powerful shift inside a family doesn't happen through confrontation or anger. It happens when someone quietly decides to stand exactly where they are and stop stepping backward. These days, when my phone rings and one of my parents says, "We're thinking about something," the conversation sounds a little different. Not dramatic, just more balanced. And the interesting thing is that I didn't have to become louder to create that change. I simply stopped agreeing to things that had never truly been mine to carry. Looking back now, the entire situation feels strangely quiet. Not because it was small, but because the turning point didn't involve anything dramatic. No shouting across a room, no family members storming out of the house, no emotional speech where everything that had been building for years finally exploded. Instead, the change happened through something much simpler, A pause. For most of my life, I believed that maintaining peace meant saying yes. I thought that being supportive meant adjusting whenever someone else had already decided what should happen next. And for a long time, that approach worked. It kept conversations calm. It kept relationships comfortable. It allowed the people around me to move forward without friction. But slowly, without anyone intending it, that quiet cooperation turned into something else. People stopped asking, not because they were unkind, but because my silence had taught them they didn't need to. The moment everything shifted wasn't when I argued about the past. It wasn't when I demanded recognition or insisted that someone apologize. It happened the day I simply declined to carry a responsibility that had been assigned to me without my agreement. No anger, no accusations, just a clear boundary. And what surprised me most was what happened afterward. The world didn't collapse. My family didn't fall apart. Relationships didn't shatter under the weight of conflict. Instead, something much healthier appeared in the space where my silence used to be. Awareness. People began asking questions they had never thought to ask before. Does that work for you? What do you think about this? Are you comfortable with that? Small questions, but powerful ones. Because sometimes the biggest shift in a relationship doesn't come from forcing people to respect you. It comes from quietly showing them that your voice has always been part of the room. It was just waiting to be used. And that's the lesson I carried forward from this experience. Being calm doesn't mean being invisible. Being kind doesn't mean accepting every responsibility someone places on your shoulders. And sometimes the strongest decision you can make is simply to stop agreeing to things that were never truly yours to carry. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment where people around you had grown so used to your silence that they stopped realizing your opinion mattered? And if that happened to you, what do you think would change if you simply paused and chose your next response more carefully? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.